Just to give a little bit about my background and who I am, since I imagine I haven't met most of the folks here. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow on a training fellowship. I work at VA Boston and MGH. VA Boston, I work with Mike. At MGH, I'm working with Joanne. Just to give you a little bit of information about me, I'm coming from the University of Miami originally. That's where I did my PhD in clinical psychology. You can see my mentor there, Jen, the fearless leader of our lab at the time. And the other point I'll bring up is that I am also a parent to this little guy here, the Schnauzer. I bring him up because he gets kind of jealous sometimes when I do Zoom talks or Zoom calls. So you may hear him in the background, or you may see me kind of trying to cajole him at various points. But we'll see if we get an appearance from him at some point along the way. So today I'll be talking about some of the neural mechanisms underlying social reward threat conflict processing in socially avoidant individuals, which is kind of a mouthful, but I'll go through each part individually. So first thing I want to talk about is just defining what is social avoidance behavior, or who are socially avoidant individuals. So social avoidance behavior is kind of a catch-all broad category of things. And really it's any overt behavior that disrupts or prevents the establishment or maintenance of social connections. So just to make that concrete, it could be something like declining an invitation to a party that maybe some of your work colleagues are throwing. Maybe you go to the party with your work colleagues, but you actually kind of just are a bit of a wallflower and you don't really interact with folks at the party. Or it could be that you avoid social interactions entirely with your work colleagues. That'd be kind of more of an extreme form. But all of these would fall under the umbrella of social avoidance behavior. And why is social avoidance behavior a problem? Well, social connections are a fundamental need most of us have as a social species. And even more concrete than that, you see that social avoidance behavior impairs a lot of domains. So for example, work networking, for those of us in research know how important that can be. So if you're not networking, if you're not reaching out to people for collaborations, it can also have an effect. So beyond just your sort of emotional well-being, it can also have occupational impairments as well. And then in terms of my background, like I mentioned, I'm clinical psychology, so I'm always interested in looking at it from that lens. And social avoidance behavior is a transdiagnostic factor. You see it really in pretty much any mental health disorder. So whether it's mood disorders, anxiety disorders, across the psychotic spectrum, you tend to see social avoidance behavior. It's pretty prevalent in almost all of these conditions. And here's just a graph to show that if you have any type of mental health condition, you're 3 times more likely to engage in social avoidance behavior on a regular basis. And importantly, social avoidance behavior doesn't seem to be just a symptom of psychopathology. It's not something that just comes around because you're having problems with mental health issues. It seems to predate a lot of mental health issues. So before the onset of a major depressive episode, you start to even see social avoidance behavior before the symptoms fully converge. So beyond just a symptom of the problem, it actually seems to be a driver of some of these problems. And unfortunately, social avoidance behaviors tend to be resistant to some of our typical treatments. Again, I'm from the clinical psychology world, so I think of things like cognitive behavioral therapy. So even after you get symptom remission, let's say depressive symptoms start to go down, you'll still often tend to see a lot of social avoidance behaviors even then. So it's something that we need to learn more about. And so that kind of brings me to where I'm coming from, which is what are some of these mechanisms that contribute to social avoidance behavior? So one of the big things that guides just any social behavior are other people's facial expressions and how we process and interpret them. So typically, if we're an observer and we see someone smiling at us with sort of this happy expression, we're more likely to want to approach that person or affiliate with that person. And when someone displays an angry facial expression, we tend to view that as a sign of social rejection, and we're more likely to avoid that person. So just at a very basic fundamental level, this guides a lot of our social behaviors we have. And the question then becomes how do facial expressions or how we process those expressions contribute to social avoidance behavior? Some previous work has been done on individual differences in processing facial expressions, but a lot of the time it's symptom-based individual differences. So things like depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and so on. And although social avoidance behavior is related to these conditions, it's really not the same thing. It's sort of its own unique construct above and beyond those types of symptoms. And the other problem is that a lot of research relies on what I call these sort of stereotypic facial expressions. This really intensive happy face, this really intensive angry face. And as you might imagine, we don't typically see these types of faces in our day-to-day lives very often. And if we did, we probably wouldn't want to interact with either one of these people very much because these are very intense emotional displays. So they rarely occur in social situations, and they tend not to elicit very robust individual differences. There's sort of this ceiling effect where everyone will tell you this is a very happy face, and everyone will tell you this is a very angry face, and there's just not much room there for individual differences. Instead, what we see in more of our daily lives, and tends to be more ecologically valid, is these more subtle facial expressions that tend to be more ambiguous. So just to walk you through this slide, so there's varying degrees of what I call social reward, or you can think of as happiness. So we start with neutral, and we go in increments to these more subtle expressions of happiness. You can see there's just a little bit of a smile, a little bit of the raised eyebrows, all the way to more full, complete happiness. Same thing for social threat. Typically, folks will have sort of subtle expressions of anger that eventually gives rise to this more full-blown display. And something that's interesting that we don't talk about as much as social conflict is this is when you have social reward and social threat happening at the same time in the same facial expression. So for example, you start here with happy 100%, here's angry 100%, and you can blend these together to where you really get 50% happy and 50% angry in the same facial expression. And this isn't something we consciously think about us doing, but there is some research that suggests that these blended facial expressions, if we want to call them, that do occur, where you have happiness and anger or happiness and another negative emotion at the same time. So these are morphs that we created in our lab when I was in graduate school. And as you can see, the numbers here denote the percentage increments. We use blending software, morphing software to blend these things into parametric 25% increments. So 0, 25, 50, 75, and then 100. So objectively, that's what we think is going on with these signals. But we wanted to conduct a study, just a kind of a pilot preliminary study, to make sure that this is how people actually perceive these morphed facial expressions. So this is the social reward continuum. We just asked people to rate both how happy and how angry is this person, and they were shown each of these faces separately in sort of a randomized order. And you can see here the green line represents how happy they think the face is, red line indicates how angry they think it is, and there's this nice parametric modulation where folks are able to detect pretty reliably and pretty accurately that the happiness is increasing, but you really don't see anything or even decreasing anger. We also asked individuals how much they want to approach and avoid these faces, just to make sure it was also modulating motivation, which is what we were really interested in. And again, we see this kind of nice, robust linear pattern where they're able to see these sort of stepwise increases in the desire to approach these faces, and there's actually a stepwise decrease in the desire to avoid these social reward faces. And we did the same thing for social threat, and we see basically the reverse pattern, which is what we might expect, these nice stepwise increases in anger but not happiness, and these nice stepwise increases in the motivation to avoid these individuals but not necessarily to approach these individuals. And the real one that we were most interested in, and frankly I was most nervous about working out, is could people detect these sort of co-occurring signals of happiness and anger? Again, we blended them to be 50-50, but do other people perceive them that way? And we do get this sort of nice disorderly interaction where across this spectrum from completely happy to completely angry, we see this nice stepwise decrease in happiness, and simultaneously we see this nice stepwise increase in anger. And at 50-50, you can see here, you're getting that folks are detecting that there's both anger and happiness in these facial expressions. And we see the same thing, although not quite as nice and symmetrical, but we do see the same thing for approach and avoidance motivation. So individuals are wanting to approach and avoid these sort of 50-50 faces with just about equal levels of intensity. So this was sort of a nice sanity check for us, just to make sure that our morphing procedure was working. And so that brings me to the current study. After we validated these faces, we wanted to see how does social avoidance behavior interact with or modulate approach avoidance ratings to these ambiguous facial expressions. And like I mentioned, some work has been done, although not with social avoidance directly. But based on prior work on individual differences, it seems like most of the individual differences tend to be in these sort of social reward threat conflict areas where you have both happiness and anger occurring at the same time. So we thought that we were most likely to see social avoidance related differences in those facial expressions, but not necessarily the social reward or the social threat in isolation when they're just blending with neutral faces. And then we also wanted to see what the neural mechanisms of this process were. So what's going on during these approach avoidance ratings. We did an exploratory whole brain analysis that I'll talk about in a bit. And again, I'm not aware of anyone who's done these sort of simultaneously approach or social reward, social threat faces, but lots of research has looked at neural mechanism of just approach avoidance conflict in general. And typically you see cortical regions like the DLPFC, the anterior cingulate cortex, and also some basal ganglia regions like the caudate. That tends to be what comes out. So we were kind of expecting to see something similar in those regions, uniquely when there was this approach avoidance conflict, because again, there's social reward and social threat happening at the same time. So to do this, we recruited a sample of 30 individuals across the spectrum of social avoidance. Just to spare the details, we used empirically defined cutoffs, and we got 10 individuals in this really clinical high range of social avoidance, 10 individuals in this moderate range, and 10 individuals in sort of this minimal social avoidance range. And you can see in this table here, we did our best to age, gender, demographically match across the social avoidance groups, which tended to work pretty well. You can see here, they're obviously, because we selected them this way, these groups, they're very different in social avoidance behavior. One of the things that is just notable, we control for it, and these relationships I talk about wind up still being significant, but there is this marginally significant difference in also internalizing symptoms, so anxiety, depression, etc. That's not something that we were necessarily trying to balance across the groups, and you can see here it is somewhat imbalanced, although in the way that you would expect. The clinical social avoidance group has higher levels of psychopathology than the moderate group and then the minimum group. And based on some of our previous work, we modeled social avoidance behavior continuously. So we selected categorically to make sure we had the full range of social avoidance behavior, but because we have only 30 subjects, we really wanted to maximize our statistical power. So we modeled it continuously using our primary measure, which is referred to as the CBAS, which is the Cognitive Behavioral Avoidance Scale, which has a social avoidance behavior subscale in it. And that's kind of our primary measure that we've used in both previous research and this study as well. And so for our data analytic plan, basically we wanted to see how does social avoidance behavior interact with these self-report ratings. And again, because we're getting these linear increases in either social reward or social threat, that's kind of how we wanted to analyze. So we use these linear polynomial models for both the social reward and social threat categories. For social conflict, you can see we ran it two ways. You could look at this as linear across this graph here, but it also has this sort of sigmoidal pattern where there's sort of this flat line, rapid increase, and then another flat line. So we analyzed it both ways. We did it both linear to be consistent with the social reward and social threat models. We also included sigmoidal coefficients just to make sure we were capturing the actual shape of the difference. And then for our neuroimaging plan, again, there's been a lot of studies done on motivation conflict, which has sort of this broad distributed regions that show up for motivational conflict. So dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, insula in the cortex, basal ganglia regions like the caudate, and also some subcortical regions like the ventral and anterior hippocampus. Again, because of just how much territory these studies often cover, and also the fact that they typically ignore parietal regions, we went ahead and did a whole brain exploratory analysis. So we're using a whole brain correction method combined voxel-wise and nominal. So p-value of p001, and it has to be 47 contiguous clusters, contiguous voxels in the clusters. For neural activation, we didn't specify a linear or sigmoidal pattern. There's been some previous research on approach avoidance conflict that suggests these things may be linear, they may be nonlinear. So we used a more flexible modeling strategy. Basically, we just said social avoidance by the trial type, approach avoid by the morph. And we didn't specify any sort of modulation pattern there. We just let it come out as the data did. So for the results, I'm going to show the self-report ratings first. This first graph is a little bit busy, so I'll kind of walk through it, and then I'll show two more kind of simplified graphs. So consistent with what we were hypothesizing, we do see that social avoidance behavior modulates approach avoidance ratings to across the social conflict spectrum. So in the blue lines here, we have low social avoidance. In the red lines, we have high social avoidance. And this is basically going from happy 100%, 75, 50-50, where there's the 50% social threat, 50% social reward, all the way down to 100% angry. And again, the blue lines are the low social avoidance group. The red lines are the high social avoidance group. And basically what we see is that if you look at the blue lines here, there's this nice symmetrical pattern between approach and avoidance going across the spectrum. So basically, whether you're talking about social threat or social reward, you have this nice symmetrical pattern where you're modulating across the spectrum. And it's relatively equal on the social reward side on the left and the social threat side on the right. But for social avoidant individuals, we see this kind of asymmetrical pattern. So we see kind of the same pattern on the social threat side of the spectrum. But if you see here on the left side, this sort of social reward side, we see that both approach is lower compared to the low socially avoidant individuals, and also avoidance is higher. So really the between group differences are maximal on the sort of social reward side of the spectrum. And if I break this into two graphs, which is a little more sensible to look at, on the left we have just approach ratings, and the right we have avoidance ratings. And you can see the difference is significant for both ratings, but it's really being driven by the approach ratings. So basically, high socially avoidant individuals tend to be less approach motivated in response to these mixed social reward signals compared to the low socially avoidant individuals. And we see the inverse pattern on the avoid ratings, but again, it's not quite as strong as we see in the approach rating condition. And then just to kind of highlight the specificity, we don't see the same pattern of results for either social reward or social threat when those are morphed in isolation. So for the social reward spectrum, we see there's kind of this main effect where they're more avoidant or they're less approach oriented, but it doesn't really seem to differ across the morphs. It's sort of this very across morphs. It doesn't seem to really matter what the particular values are. They tend to be more approach oriented or less, or more avoidant oriented or less approach oriented. And then for social threat, we see something very similar. So there's really no interactions going on with the specific values of the mixing procedure or the morphs themselves. So you can see that in the significance values here. So just to show that this really seems to be specific to this sort of social reward threat continuum for the self-report ratings. So the next thing we looked at was the neural activation in our whole brain analysis. And for the social reward threat conflict condition, we see, even at this more stringent whole brain correction threshold, we see a whole range of regions, both frontal, parietal, and subcortical. We see regions like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We see some parietal areas like the superior parietal lobule, but also kind of like anterior ventral hippocampus or the perihippocampal gyrus. Something to keep in mind is that we do the same exact neural activation models for our social reward and our social threat models, and we see a lot of these same overlapping regions come out. So it's an open question as to how specific this is in terms of neural activation. So to try to get at that specificity, to see if this is really about conflict or if this is about ambiguity, whether it's reward or threat, we try to do kind of this conjunction contrast is what I call it. But basically we take the neural activation for our social threat conflict model, we compare that to the neural activation for both our social reward and our social threat model, and basically we say that this needs to be significantly different than both of these models at the same p = 0.001 whole brain correction level, which is very stringent, but this will, in theory, give us the most specific to reward threat conflict. And basically, when we do that sort of strict specificity analysis, we come up with one region, and AFNI, which is where I did all these analyses, flips the siding here, so I apologize for the confusion. This is actually the right, even though it shows up left on the screen, this is the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So this is the one region that seems to be really, really specific to social reward threat conflict that interacts with social avoidance behavior. And that's really kind of what I'll show today. And these results are pretty complicated. I'm open to any suggestions. We're kind of scratching our heads, trying to make sense of them. So this is the neural activation for the social reward threat continuum model. Again, this is coming from the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And what we see here, again, red is the high socially avoidant individuals, blue is low social avoidance. And we're moving from the happy side of the model, social reward, to 50-50, both reward and threat, over here to predominantly social threat, and not as much social reward. And what we see is basically in the approach condition, if you squint, and depending on how generous you want to be with your interpretation or your willingness to suspend disbelief, it's somewhat of a sigmoidal pattern, certainly not a clean one, but that's kind of the closest approximation of the shape, at least in my view, I can come up with, where you kind of have this maximal between group difference and sort of this happy 75, angry 25, and then this happy, angry 50-50 condition before it drops back down on the threat side. In the avoid condition, we see that the high socially avoidant individuals are just sort of generally more elevated in their DLPFC activation compared to the low socially avoidant individuals. So it doesn't seem to really differ as a function of the specific ratio of happy to angry. It just seems to be that during avoidance, they're just more globally activated in this region for high socially avoidant individuals compared to low socially avoidant individuals. So again, just to kind of try to summarize these complicated figures, you kind of had this, again, depending on your interpretation, sigmoidal shape for approach, where you kind of are maximal between group differences in this conflict area before dropping off for this more threat side of the equation. And then just as kind of a reminder, this kind of region here, the social reward kind of conflict region here, is also where we were seeing some of our self-report findings as well. So even though it's not a clean mirror image between brain and behavior, there is kind of some, if you squint at it, mirroring between what we're seeing neural activation-wise and what we're seeing in the self-report ratings-wise. And then just as a discussion, just to kind of summarize what we found, social avoidance behavior does tend to uniquely modulate approach avoidance conflict motivation, approach motivation to social conflict. And really what we're seeing is there's sort of this blunted approach as the ratio of reward to threat increases. So basically as you have more reward and less threat, approach doesn't tend to go along for the ride for socially avoidant individuals. They tend to be more blunted in how much they're willing to approach across that continuum. And we also see heightened avoidance, again, as the ratio of reward to threat increases in some of these social conflict facial displays. One thing I didn't note earlier, but I think is important, we also collected, just like we did in our preliminary study, we collected emotion perception ratings, so how happy or how angry they see each of these faces. And there's no interactions with social avoidance behavior there. So this doesn't seem to be attributable to the fact that individuals that are socially avoidant view these faces differently. They say these faces as just as happy or just as angry as a non-socially avoidant individual. So it seems like it's really something to do with them getting the same social information from these cues and how they perceive it in terms of how happy or how angry these faces are. But really the differences start to show up in how much they want to approach and avoid. So not how they perceive the faces, but what they want to do behaviorally with that information in terms of how much they approach or how much they avoid those faces. And then at the neural activation level, really the highest degree of specificity was in this right DLPFC region, which shows up in a lot of other studies on approach avoidance conflict. And again, it's a complicated pattern, but we see that for social avoidance, there's this stronger activation of the DLPFC during approach ratings that again tends to be kind of falling in this ratio of reward to threat. So as the ratio of reward to threat increases, you tend to see greater between group differences in the approach ratings. But then for avoidance ratings, we just kind of see this generally stronger activation of the DLPFC during avoidance for high socially avoidant individuals compared to low socially avoidant individuals. And just some quick kind of interpretations on these findings. This is kind of preliminary, but this is what I've come up with so far. Big take home, it does seem like social avoidance dysregulates motivation specifically to conflicting, and I say social reward signals here. There's sort of this asymmetrical pattern of approach avoidance. Again, we see heightened approach as social reward increases and threat decreases. So it really does seem to be like there's something about when you mix social reward with social threat, and specifically when you have more social reward to compare to social threat, but there's still a little bit of that social threat signal in there, that's where you start to see the associations with social avoidance behavior. So there's something about these predominantly happy, but also a little bit angry faces that really seems to dysregulate motivation for socially avoidant individuals. And at the neural level, we see again, right DLPFC tends to be what's associated with the social avoidance behavior. And there's been previous research not on social conflict, but on just approach avoidance conflict in general. And it seems like what right DLPFC activation does from a mechanistic point of view is it really inhibits reward seeking or approach behavior when you have co-occurring threat and reward, or in other words, motivational conflict. So that's really when you see the right DLPFC kind of governing behavioral outputs, is specifically during motivational conflicts. And from a behavioral point of view, what it tends to do is it really dampens down your approach behavior when you're experiencing this motivational conflict. And there's also been some neuromodulation studies on RTMS that seem to suggest that if you excite the RDLPFC, which is what we were seeing for our socially avoidant individuals, that tends to inhibit motivation, approach motivation specifically during motivational conflicts. So kind of the take-home message might be, and again, I'm open to other interpretations depending on what other folks think, is that social avoidance behavior seems to be driven almost by this failure to capitalize on, I put in quotes here, risky social reward signals. So there's a little bit of social threat there. It's still predominantly social reward, but people are failing to approach those signals. So it's a subtle difference. Again, there's a little bit of a social threat in there, but it really seems like that's what's driving a lot of social avoidance behavior. It's this failure to approach when there's a little bit of threat, but it's still predominantly social reward. And just to give a few limitations, as there always are, because this is cross-sectional, we don't know if approach avoidance modulation is something that's associated with social avoidant behavior, or if this really drives social avoidant behavior. So if we had some sort of longitudinal study or an EMA, momentary ecological assessment study, we might be able to tease apart, if this is really driving the behavior, or if this is just something that socially avoidant individuals tend to have just in general as a sort of trait-like feature. And as I mentioned earlier, these social avoidance groups, we did not match them on psychiatric symptoms. In all of our analyses, we conducted them with controlling for the DAS, which measures anxiety and depression, and things still remain significant. But that doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility that social avoidance modulates behavior differentially in mood versus anxiety disorders. You might imagine that in mood disorders like depression, there might be more effects for social reward, and for anxiety, you might imagine there might be more social threat effects. So we try to control for that, but it's not something that we can definitively rule out by any stretch. And just kind of some big picture implications here. Social avoidance doesn't seem to be about avoiding social threat, which typically in anxiety work, kind of my background in clinical psychology, we think of things like social anxiety as being driven by this avoidance of social threat or rejection. It really seems to be more about failure to approach these sort of risky social rewards. And it could be that neuromodulation might be helpful using this right DLPFC as a treatment target. This might give us some insight on what we want to target to try to improve the ability of individuals to approach these more risky social rewards. And then last, just to conclude, just a big thank you to everyone in my lab and graduate school, mostly to Jen, again, down here, who provided seemingly infinite amounts of support, both intellectually, emotionally, financially, etc. Just was always a huge supporter throughout graduate school and wouldn't have been able to do this project without her, in addition to other projects. And then there was a few funding sources we cobbled together. Not listed here is Jen's startup grant, which really did the heavy lifting on a lot of my dissertation. So another big thank you to her for helping fund the project as well.